Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Can you hear me okay? Great. I'm really thrilled to open this event today, and this is our first in-person event at the School of Global Policy and Strategy, and we're going to discuss Barbara Walter's new book on how civil wars start and how to stop them. And I have to say that while I'm thrilled to open this event, I'm a little less thrilled. In fact, I'm deeply concerned about the stark evidence that Professor Walter presents. The book meticulously documents the rise in violent extremism around the globe and shows the increasing likelihood of civil war in the United States. And it starts with the planned kidnapping of Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, where of course the trial is now ongoing. And as she'll discuss today, this is what a second civil war might look like. More like these scary, isolated incidents than the type of war, civil war from the past. But I don't think she's going to leave us entirely hopeless. She reminds us how South Africa, which was far closer to civil war in the late 1980s than we are now, managed to escape it, and what will it take to get there, including reforms to promote equity and inclusion, as well as the power to turn down social media without limiting free speech. So here's the book, and then I'm just going to give a brief introduction of the two speakers, and we'll jump right in. So Barbara F. Walter is the Rohr Professor of International Affairs at the University of California, San Diego. She's the New York Times best-selling author of How Civil Wars Start and How to Stop Them, as well as numerous other books on civil wars. Walter is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, a frequent guest on CNN, and an active consultant for the World Bank, the UN, the Departments of Defense and State, and the January 6th Committee. When she's not doing research, she writes for many news outlets such as the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and others. She also founded the blog post Political Violence at a Glance with Erica Chenoweth in 2012. And that blog sometimes beats out Monkey Cage as the best blog of the year. And of course, now she's been in the media much, much more around this book. And Thad Kousser, who will be interviewing Professor Walter today, is a professor of political science and chair of the department. He writes on American state and national politics, voting reforms, direct democracy, and how politicians use social media. He has authored or edited several books on related topics, including The Logic of American Politics and Politics in the American States, among others, on state power and term limits. He received UCSD's Academic Senate's Distinguished Teaching Award. He serves as co-editor on several journals and has worked in California, New Mexico, and United States Senate. And he also comments on many news venues such as NPR, CNBC Asia, New York Times, et cetera. So we have two great panelists here to talk about the book, and I very much look forward to the discussion. Go ahead, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Jean Freund. Thanks so much for all of you for being here, braving one of the first in-person events, and congratulations, Barb. We, at UCSD, we are so thrilled for you, so proud of you. You took on the debate that's really at the center of American politics and thus profoundly important for the world. It's the most important debate of the day, and you elevated that by bringing in data, by bringing in systematic arguments, drawing on your lifetime's worth of experience studying civil wars, and by bringing reasoned argumentation to this really passionate subject. So now you're going to forever be New York Times best-selling author, Barb Walter, and pretty soon people are going to get journalist Barbara Walters confused with you. So when you started writing this book, you were drawing on your experience from countries outside the United States, but you knew you were writing about the United States. So let's trace the argument. You have 4 building blocks, 4 risk factors. Let's trace them and tell us about what you see in other countries, and then we'll talk about their application to the United States. Then we'll get to questions that were posited by our online audience, that it numbers about 300, and then we'll get to questions in the last 15 minutes from you all. So start out with the factors.
First of all, thank you all for being here. Thank you, Dean Freund, for having me here, and Thad, thanks for reading the book and sitting up here with me. I started thinking about this book in 2016, and to be honest, when I started to write it, I thought it was going to be a labor of love and nothing beyond that. In fact, I thought it was probably going to hurt my career. Because I really believed it was going to fall through the cracks. I was not writing an academic book, so academics were not going to be interested in this book. In fact, when I talked about putting it on my review for UCSD, I was told that it wasn't really going to count because it wasn't an academic book. And I thought the mass public wasn't going to read it because it was going to be too academic-y. And I still did it because I felt like there was all of this information that I had. I've been studying civil wars for 30 years around the globe. There's an enormous amount of amazing research on civil wars, and it's not accessible to the public. It's not known by the public. And even academics, they'll know sections of that research, but putting it all together and connecting all the dots and telling a coherent story just hadn't been done. And so I felt like it was this labor of love to do that. And if people were interested in it, fine, but really it was sort of the culmination of a career of studying this. In 2017, I got asked to serve on a task force run through the CIA, and it was called the Political Instability Task Force, and I served on it for 5 years until the end of 2021. And the task force, our mission was to help the US government come up with a predictive model that would help them predict what countries around the world would experience instability and political violence in the near future. The CIA is not allowed to study the United States. We never talked about the United States. And in fact, in the early years, it didn't occur to us to even think about it. We studied the countries of Africa. We studied Sierra Leone and Liberia. We studied the countries of Central Asia, Tajikistan and Georgia, the countries of the Middle East, Southeast Asia. And the model, when we first started working on it, and the task force, by the way, was a mixture of academics, experts, political scientists, economists, sociologists, anthropologists who studied conflict, and data analysts. And the data analysts were in charge of the model, and we would sit in conference rooms in hotels in suburban Virginia, and the data analysts would grill us, and they would say, tell us everything that you think could potentially be important in the outbreak of civil war. And we talked about a lot of things. We talked about, in fact, we considered over 30 different factors: poverty, income inequality, how ethnically and religiously diverse a country was, whether the country geographically was large or not, or small, whether it had a really big population or not, everything we could think of. And the data analysts played with these factors until they found a model that best predicted civil war. And they looked at political instability, whether a government had a change of leadership, but they also looked at civil war. And it turns out that 2 factors, more than anything else, predicted civil war. This surprised us. We thought the model was going to be more complicated than that. And it also surprised us which of the 2 variables were important. Again, we had no influence on it. In fact, we were agnostic about which factors would ultimately be important and which should be important. And the data analysts found that the 2 important variables was something called anocracy. And I remember when I wrote that down, I thought my editor is going to make me take that out because it's just horrible political science lingo for partial democracy. Anocracy simply means partial democracy. It's governments that are neither fully democratic nor fully autocratic. There's something in between. My editor loved that term. Again, I don't know why. She said, no, this is going to resonate because people are seeing that democracies are declining, but they think about political regimes as governments as either being democracies or non-democracies. And non-democracies, they're thinking about authoritarian countries. They're thinking about Iran. They're thinking about these types of regimes. They're not thinking that there could be something short of that in fact could be even more dangerous, at least in the short term. So this first factor was really important. It turns out that fully democratic governments, countries, almost never experience civil war. Fully autocratic governments rarely experience civil war. Almost all of the violence happens in between these two governments. The second factor that turned out to be really important was something that we called ethnic factionalism. Again, that's a political science term for a population that has decided to organize itself politically around identity. So you have political parties that are not based on what people believe ideologically. So you don't have a socialist party and a liberal party or however, or a left party and a right party. But people organize themselves based on their ethnicity, their religion, or their race. And it's countries that are these partial democracies with identity-based parties that are the ones that are at the highest risk of civil war. So if a country has these two features, the task force would put that country on what we called a watch list. It was really called the watch list. And we would give it to the Department of Defense and to the White House. And I don't know what they did with it, I assumed. They watched these countries. But these countries were considered at high risk of political violence. So I'm sitting at these meetings. We're meeting 4 times a year. And I would leave these meetings and I would read the newspaper like the rest of us, and I would watch what's going on here in the United States, and I started to see that these two factors started to emerge here, and they started to emerge at a surprisingly fast rate. So, most Americans know that our democracy has gotten weaker, but they don't know to what degree, because they don't follow the data sets. They're not checking the data every year the way academics are. But the US's democracy has declined since 2016. We were downgraded for the first time in 2016 for a number of reasons, but one of the big reasons was because international election observers, they go to all countries around the world. They come here as well. And they monitored the 2016 election, and they deemed it free, but not entirely fair. And it wasn't entirely fair, in their opinion, because there was partisan meddling at the local level, and because, and this was confirmed by our intelligence agencies, because the Russians under Putin had meddled via social media, tried to influence the outcome of that election as well. We were downgraded again in 2019, and in that case it was because the executive branch, the White House, refused to respond to requests for information from Congress and refused to reply to subpoenas. If you know how the U.S. government has been constituted, our founding fathers set up a series of checks and balances. And the biggest check on executive power is the legislature. And our executive branch, the president here in the United States, has been growing in power relative to the other branches long before even Donald Trump came to power. So we were downgraded again, and then by the end of 2020, by the end of Donald Trump's administration, we were downgraded for the first time since 1800 to an anocracy. And the reason for that was because we had a sitting president who was unwilling to accept the results of the election and actively tried to overturn it.
So let's talk a little bit more about this point. So, and bring in your comparative perspective.
Yeah.
So one of the scores, the most commonly used score that you cite when you provide this documentation is Polity. Polity goes from 10 full democracy to -10 full autocracy. The anocracy realm is -5 to 5. We went from a 10 when Donald Trump was first elected to a 5.
Yeah.
For context, South Africa in 1988 under apartheid was a 4.
Yeah.
Is it really that bad? Have we gone so far so quickly? In a comparative perspective, looking at the countries that you study and know so well, do you have this sense that that's where we are right now?
So it's where we are well, first of all, we were upgraded again to a +8. So currently we're at a +8. That happened after we had a peaceful transfer of power. Joe Biden was inaugurated, and we now have an administration that's adhering to the rule of law. But that could change quite quickly. The thing to understand about this measure anocracy, it comes from a nonprofit organization called the Center for Systemic Peace. It measures every single country around the world every year, and it's not necessarily interested in democracy per se. It will look at, Belarus and Botswana. It looks at every country, whether it's a democracy or not. It's interested in the strength of democratic institutions, and in particular constraints on executive power. So it's not really in some ways the best measure of democracy per se. The Center for Systemic Peace, for example, does not consider suffrage. It is not interested in popular participation in government, whether every single group in society has an equal right to vote. There are other data sets that measure that. Varieties of Democracy, which is done through an organization in Sweden, is really interested in that. The Polity scale really looks very specifically at institutions, checks and balances. And I don't know why they do that. That's what they chose to do. I think really it's an enormous data set, and anocracy is just one of the measures. It looks at other different things. But it is really interesting because it's almost assuming that it doesn't, that you really need strong checks and balances in order to preserve a democracy over time. It doesn't mean it's going to be a perfect democracy. It doesn't mean that it's a democracy that allows everybody to vote, but to preserve it from a strong man or a strong woman who might come into power. And again, the task force was really agnostic about what measure of democracy mattered the most. We included lots of different other measures that talked about whether there was full participation and full suffrage in a country. The variable that mattered the most was this measure of the strength of the institutions. So it does seem, when you think, oh my gosh, the United States is a -5, does that mean it's kind of just does that mean it's equal to some of these other countries? And what was the example you gave?
South Africa.
Oh, South Africa, where you didn't, where you had a minority regime and the majority black population was completely disenfranchised. It's different because it's really just looking at one aspect of democracy.
And maybe, thanks for pointing out checks and balances. Maybe that's something we can get back to. One of the clear lines of inquiry that the online audience was most interested in is how do you protect and preserve? So
Yeah.
we'll get there. But let's keep building your argument.
Yeah.
So factionalization,
Yeah.
factionalism. What is that? What are the risks that it creates for and who are the people
Yeah,
who
yeah.
are most likely? Who are these sons of the soil?
Yeah. Yeah, so Thad asked about 4 factors, and I talked about 2. Those are the 2 underlying conditions that put countries at high risk of civil war. But then there's the question of who tends to start civil wars. And I talk about this group that's called Sons of the Soil. And again, if you look historically, if you look at all the other countries that have experienced civil war, especially those that have experienced ethnically based, where it breaks down along ethnic or religious lines, it tends to be started by the same type of group. And again, it's not who you think. Most people think that civil wars are going to be started by the poorest groups in society, or by the groups that are most heavily discriminated against, or by immigrants. They don't start civil wars. They tend to not to have the capacity to do that. They're working really hard. They don't have access to resources. Governments tend to be keeping their eye on those groups and repressing them pretty heavily. The groups that tend to start civil wars are groups that had once been politically dominant in a country but are in decline. And so it's when they are losing power or they have recently lost power that they become heavily disenchanted with the existing system, an existing system that they can no longer compete in. And that's when they begin, or at least extreme elements within that group begin to mobilize. And I'll give you a really good example of, well, and then let me talk about the 4th, and then I'll give you an example to bring this all to life. So the 4th question that we grappled with is, okay, you have these underlying conditions, you have this declining group that we call Sons of the Soil. What about the timing? These underlying conditions and these groups can be declining for a long period of time. What accounts for when they turn to violence? And I talk about it as a loss of hope. It's when this group has hard evidence that, in fact, they're never going to get power back legitimately or by working within the system. And that's when extreme elements of their group who promote radical and extra-legal means of change, that's when they begin to be able to start recruiting from the larger population. And you see some of that happening here in the United States. So the really classic example of all of this is the former Yugoslavia. So in 1989, between 1989 and 1991, the Soviet Union is declining. Yugoslavia suddenly finds itself free to choose whatever political system it wants. And Yugoslavs very quickly decide they want democracy. And so you're going from a government under Tito that was an authoritarian regime to a situation where now there's competitive elections. It's not a full democracy. The democratic institutions are brand new. The government is still weak. It would be solidly in the anocracy zone, but it moved there quite rapidly. You had old-time Communist Party members. Slobodan Milosevic had political power during the Soviet era. He suddenly finds himself in this new world where he has to actually compete in competitive elections. He knows that Yugoslavs hate communists, and he knows that they know that he's a communist. So he's not going to be competitive compared to these newbies that are coming on the scene, promising democracy, promising all sorts of goodies. But he's smart and he's strategic, and he figures out that Serbs are the largest ethnic group in Yugoslavia, and he's a Serb. So if he can convince Serbs not to vote for whoever was running as a socialist or a communist or a reformist, but instead vote for a Serb, then he could potentially have enough votes to win. And that's exactly what he did. He had control of state radio, he had control of state television, and he propagated this continuous message of fear and of impending threat and of insecurity and change. And he kept telling the Serbs, if you don't stick together during this time of uncertainty, if you don't vote for a Serb, then the Croats are going to vote for a Croat, and the Croats are going to come to power, and if the Croats gain political power, then they're going to throw all of you out of your jobs, they're going to throw you out of the military, and some of them could start killing you like they did during World War II. And it was this incredibly effective message that resonated with average people because they were living in a period of change and uncertainty. They were insecure about what was happening and who was going to come to power. And Milosevic convinced them to back him in this Serb party, which is a classic ethnic faction.
Right, so he created one of the underlying conditions.
He did.
Right, and so this was, and so now this story, and it's similar to the story of the Ba'ath Party and the Sunni Muslims in Iraq,
yeah.
right? So there's this moment, and there's this spark. So what's the spark that leads to the conflagration? And what do you, or in either
Yeah.
of those countries, or what do you see as that spark,
Yeah.
as a possibilities for that spark in the United States now?
Yeah. So okay, I'm going to put my social scientist hat on. We actually don't know. We don't have a lot of evidence, and there haven't been a lot of studies about what that spark is. So if there's graduate students in the room who are looking for dissertation topics, this is such an important question that we don't have a lot of hard evidence for. There's been, one or two studies that point to the power of elections. I'll talk about that in a second. There have been one or two studies that talk about the power of failed protests. So when I talk about the loss of hope, I think, happens when these declining groups suddenly see that working within the system will have no effect. This happened in Northern Ireland with the Catholics. They had been protesting for decades, peacefully protesting for decades against the very repressive and discriminatory Protestant regime. And they lost hope and shifted their support to the Provisional IRA, who were the extreme group within their population advocating for violence. The Provisional IRA really was a fringe movement and couldn't really grow until one thing happened, and that was in 1972. You started to have the Catholics began to protest more and more and more. They had been emboldened by what was happening here in the United States during the Civil Rights Movement, and they were modeling a lot of what they were doing in Northern Ireland with what African Americans were doing here. And they were becoming, the protests were getting bigger. And the Protestant government was pushing back more harshly, sending in paramilitary forces, and it was shifting into riots. And the Protestant government kind of panicked, and they called London and they asked Westminster to send British soldiers to Northern Ireland to come help them pacify the Catholic population. They didn't consider actually reforming the government. That was not something that they were willing to do. So they called in the British soldiers, and Catholics were thrilled. They welcomed the British soldiers, which might seem counterintuitive, but it wasn't at the time, because Catholics knew that the Ulster Protestants in Northern Ireland were bums. That they were never going to change. That they were going to hold on to their disproportionate power no matter what happened. They knew that was going to be the case, but they thought the British were better. And they thought the British were truly democratic, and that the British, if they did get involved, would side with the Catholics, because it was the Catholics who were being oppressed. And instead, the British soldiers went door to door in Catholic neighborhoods, dragged the men, threw them into jail, didn't hold trials, bashed people's head in public, and that then radicalized average Catholics, and suddenly the provisional IRA, had the support of the population to really kind of take off. So you have with protests, yeah. I was going to talk about elections, but we could talk about that later.
Well, maybe I'll give you an election example, but
Yeah.
so I'm as an American politics scholar, right? So I was thinking about what the echoes are here. And when I was reading that, I was thinking of failed protests that were deeply discouraging to marginalized communities, 1965, 1992, summer of 2020. Sparks that didn't turn into conflagrations, didn't turn into anything resembling the Troubles. And then I think of perhaps the worst case scenario, if when maybe that you were thinking about when you're writing this book, certainly something that I was worried about, which was we had an election in 2020 in which the Sons of the Soil, right, lost by an incredibly narrow margin, right? This was a very close election in 2020. It was contested. The side that was most aggrieved and best armed lost. Then they had a failed protest in the Capitol, and it did not lead, and you had a president who tried to overturn and tried to use his influence to overturn, and American institutions held strong. In much of the way that, as an Americanist, I think of ours as a relatively violent democracy that has had huge eras. We're talking in post-bellum South, we're talking 1,000 people killed per election. Mostly black Americans killed by state and non-state actors. You see violence again in the civil rights movement. You see labor movement and anti-labor violence. You see tremendous number of assassinations of very important figures. You see attacks in 1954 where 30 shots are fired onto the House of Representatives floor. We've had all of these potential sparks, and yet we've had institutions that have remained resilient. What do we think? Why do we think things are different now? And then pivoting, what are the ways to strengthen those institutions to fight back against larger risks?
So one of the keys to the spark actually setting a fire is if the government uses disproportionate force. So if you have a situation where you have average citizens, they're protesting, they're unhappy with the government, they would like the status quo to change in a variety of ways, but they're working within the system. Protesting actually is a sign that you believe in the system and that you believe that going out into the street is going to have an effect. If the government responds really disproportionately, and part of it could be, by accident, these things can spiral out of control. But part of it could just be, the government just miscalculates, or is the chain of command isn't particularly good. If average citizens see the government attacking peaceful protesters, that has this really incendiary effect. And when I think about January 6th, it's such a great example. When January 6th happened, I got all these calls and emails. People were shocked. They were horrified, and they kept asking me, "What do you think? What do you think?" And I said, actually, I'm relieved. I'm relieved in two ways. I'm relieved that this was so public and so egregious and so clear, because I've been talking about the growth of domestic terror in the United States for 10 years. I've been talking about this problem that we have with far-right extremism, and that they were arming themselves and they were training, and nobody wanted to hear that message.
People believed you.
And now people believe it because it was out in the open. So I actually think January 6th was a gift to the American public, and to at least our politicians who are willing to admit it, because it brought this cancer out into the open. And the second reason I was relieved was because the police response was so absent almost. And there was a lot of criticism for the fact that the protesters, let's call them protesters, were able to walk into the Capitol, and they were able to tear down paintings and steal podiums, and people were really angry at this. And as somebody who studies how these types of movements will explode and turn violent, I thought, this is actually not fantastic, but this is also a gift, because if there had been a harsh government response, the far right would have used this and they would have portrayed it as hard evidence that the federal government really is anti-American citizen, anti-patriot, and it would have grown their movement in a way that hasn't happened. And so the spark really is whether the government provides this evidence that extremists are going to use to grow their movement. Here in the United States, the far right, the militias that have been growing, about 65% of them are white supremacist groups. About 25% are anti-federal government groups. And there's overlap there. Their message is that the federal government is illegitimate, that it is overreaching the power that it has, and it needs to be eliminated. So you can imagine what would have happened if they had actually observed the federal government responding to these protesters who truly believed they were American patriots, who were defending the Constitution against an election that was being illegally stolen. So if the government had responded, I think we would have had a much bigger problem on our hands.
Great. So let's talk about other ways
Yeah.
to prevent this. So you have questions. What are the best techniques to avoid a civil war? I'm especially interested in the how to stop them part. And how can alumni contribute to the peace process? So what are the things that you would say are your
Yeah.
prescriptions for America going forward?
Yeah. So I actually think one big prescription is simply to recognize that we have this problem. And that's really important. We know the warning signs of civil wars. That again is also a gift. We know what the preconditions are, and if you know what the preconditions are, then you can do something about it. And I'll give you a sense of how much, maybe how much time we have. Governments that have those who are anocracies with these ethnic factions and that are put on this watch list, and considered at high risk of civil war, they have about a 4% annual risk of civil war. 4%. That seems small, and in some ways it is, but in some ways it isn't. It means that every year that you do not change those two conditions, every year that you don't strengthen your democracy, every year that you have a party or parties that are, appealing to race and religion and ethnicity as opposed to political ideas, every year you increase 4%. So by 10, 20, 30 years, the risk of civil war in any given year is quite high. So simply knowing these warning signs early means that we can do something to change it. We now know how important it is to focus on strengthening our democracy. It's not neutral. And I think Americans until recently were complacent, or for me, surprisingly complacent about democratic decline here, because they're thinking, wow, we're a long way from Iran. Like, we're not going to become Iran. This is, and even if we were, it's so far in the future, it's something we don't have to worry about. But if you know that it's anocracy where the violence happened, and if you know that we actually were there at the end of 2020, then that puts an impetus to focus on that. So that is, just acknowledge that the United States does have a problem, and it's coming from within. And then, actually, I'm going to throw this back to you, Thad, because you know a lot more about how you reform, how do you strengthen America's democracies? For me, you'd either do it from the top down or the bottom up. The Republican Party doesn't want to reform because the system as it currently stands actually benefits them, and they'd actually like to cement in, additional ways to lengthen their rule. But the Democrats, even if they wanted to reform our democracy, they tried with the filibuster. They don't have the votes to do that. Then if it comes from the bottom up, you're counting on Americans willing to go out and actually peacefully protest, demand that their politicians actually do something. And, I think there's a lot of uncertainty about whether Americans are willing to do that at this point and whether they would be willing to sustain it. So how do we reform American democracy?
Well, I think there are each party is calling for certain reforms, right? And reform is in the eye of the beholder. And each of these reforms, right, would clearly benefit each party politically in the short term, right?
Yeah.
So if you're talking, and I think part of the idea is sort of how do you get beyond that to things where you can find some bipartisan consensus, because they in the absence of knowing who's going to win the next election, they will guarantee that whoever is the rightful winner will actually take office. And so I think a lot of the election reform community is focused not on some of these important debates we've been having about voting rights, but we've been having forever, and they're pretty deadlocked, and there's not a clear opportunity for solution, but about things like modernizing the Electoral Count Act, which would basically ensure that state legislatures don't have the power to override votes of their public, right? And a second is to ward off electoral manipulation. So the thing that saved American democracy, in some ways, in my view, or the thing that saved the 2020 election, was how fragmented into state and local control our electoral system was. Most countries have an electoral system that's centralized. Then the president, if they want to change and overthrow an election, they have that ability. But Donald Trump was left he had, to much to his consternation, he had to call the Republican Secretary of State in Georgia to try to berate him into doing it. He had to spend all year trying to berate the Republican Nevada Secretary of State and stop that person from doing mail-in voting. He tried to get the Maricopa County folks to override their election results. He failed in all of those because even members of his own party, and then he lost cases in Trump-appointed judges. The fragmentation of the American political system, where we set in place radical checks and balances between state and local governments, between judicial, executive, and legislative branches, allowed an opportunity for people to do their job and stand up to the most powerful person in the world and stop him from stealing an election.
What do you say about, elections here in the United States really are decided by now just a handful of states. It's the swing states. Everybody knows which states those are. And the Republican Party is now targeting those states to put loyalists in place who could then potentially overturn elections. So does that worry you? Does it worry you that we now have a Supreme Court that's very one-sided and is unlikely to serve as a check, less likely to serve as a check on states and a check on the executive as well? What do you say about that?
Right. So I think that is worrying, and I promise we're going to get to you guys for questions. We could sit here all day, and we're going to have later opportunities to do that. So I'll try to summarize these things really quickly, my take on those. So, look, Supreme Court's ebb and flow. Right now we have a Supreme Court where one of the seats, didn't reflect the electoral outcomes, right? And in some ways we have an illegitimacy to one of the seats, right? So I think that creates a problem, and it'll be a long-standing one. But the right way to attack that, I think, is to win elections rather than to pack the court, right? And I think the Biden administration has been made the right political call on that. The second is our electoral college system, which doesn't empower small states or rural states, and empowers competitive states, creates incentives for people to run to the median voter in Michigan, Wisconsin, North Carolina, Virginia, Arizona, Georgia, and Florida and Ohio, right? So the way that you win elections in America is by running to the middle. Now we don't have perfectly centrist candidates, but we have a lot more centrist candidates than we would get if the way to win American elections was a national popular vote system, which would mean the way to win the election is to run up the score for Democrats in California and New York, or to run up the score from Republicans in the Deep South and Mountain West, right? Plus, If you wanted to run an election, a nationwide presidential election, you would need billions and billions of dollars. And now we have a campaign finance system that, for all its flaws, the presidential election hasn't been determined really by who raises the most money. Donald Trump got outraised by a ton in 2016 and still won the election. Right? We don't have a system where you have to run a national election, and if we got rid of the electoral college and moved to a national vote count, that would lead to some important things. We wouldn't have wrong winner elections with the popular and the electoral vote going, but it would also create incentives to run to the wings and to rely on big funders much more than we have today. So let's go. We're going to open it up to questions to you in a couple minutes. But I want to give you the chance to bring this all together. Sort of, where are we now? You both wrote this book, and you've been on this amazing journey. You can't turn on the television without seeing you. And you've been thinking and talking about this to people from all different perspectives. So, how has that process changed your thinking? What is your thinking on this in March of 2022, and where do you think we're going on a civil war in America?
You know, I'm much more hopeful today than I was even in November of last year, because as I said at the very beginning, I didn't think people would read this book. I didn't think this book would find an audience. And the fact that it has, and that it's resonated so much, and the fact that people are talking about it, suggests that other people have been seeing these changes, and they're worried about it, and they want to do something about it. I think this is the last book that people on the far right would ever like to see out there. It exposes what's happening, and again, it makes it more likely that and I know, for example, the FBI is much more active in trying to root out domestic terror than it was a year ago. It's January 6th certainly helped. Prior to January 6th, most of the money in the U.S. government, at the Department of Homeland Security and at the FBI, was focused on rooting out Islamist terrorist organizations and they've been quite effective. There has not been an attack on the United States since January 11th, 2001, but focusing so heavily on that one type of foreign group meant that this bigger problem was being ignored. So I'm much hopeful in that way. And then actually I wanted to end with one other point about something that the U.S. government could do that would have a really, really big effect, and that is to regulate social media. I think social media, and in particular, the recommendation engines that have been developed by the big tech companies, all 5 of them, by the way, are U.S. companies. So regulating this would be relatively easy. Their recommendation engines are designed to keep people as engaged as possible on their devices. That's their business model. The problem is the type of information that our reptilian brains like to focus on and that captures our attention more than anything else is the information that's incendiary, that taps into our emotions of fear, threat, insecurity, and it's ready-made for wannabe autocrats and for ethnic entrepreneurs who want to use identity to catapult themselves into power. It's ready-made for them to get a bullhorn, and it shunts information that's going to be unifying to the side. So we have, most Americans get their news from social media, and it's entirely unregulated. And I'm not saying censor information. I actually don't think they should get into that business. Let people put whatever information they want online, but don't create a bullhorn where you take the most incendiary information and push it increasingly in the hands of individuals that we now know serves to radicalize people on both sides of the debate. So you know, there's a reason why we're seeing democratic decline and the rise of ethnic nationalism and the rise of hate crimes at this particular point in time. It's because we have this new tool, this new medium out there that's pushing that sort of message, and that's creating an environment for that to happen.
You call it the accelerant in your book.
Yeah.
Although I'll note one sort of happy silver lining is the people who are going to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer, they got caught because they posted about it on social media. So, you know, if you want to, the kind of nice way to balance surveillance and security with civil liberties is, you know, you don't have to spy on people if they're just going to post it, right, and tweet about it. So, all right. So that was wonderful. First, let's pause and just give her a huge round of applause for. And then we have a microphone in the back, and so I see a couple hands. We'll go here, there, and then into the middle. Yeah.
Oh, thanks so much for coming. Wonderful. I guess I want to ask you the question first, and then maybe I can ask you. You were talking about how you didn't want to. You thought packing the court was a bad idea, but democracy is kind of the imperative here. But isn't like the Supreme Court the most anti-democratic form of our government? I mean, these are not elected people. Wouldn't packing the court be a way to kind of correct some of this undemocratic system that was established, you know, a long time ago? Wouldn't packing the court be a step in the right direction? I mean, it doesn't reflect the views of the country. And I guess if there would be a civil war, who would be fighting it? I guess would be my question. Like who are, because like we're a series of states, right? And the kind of different, I guess, tribal identities are mixed within the different states. What would you see would be the combatants, and if we're talking civil war?
Just briefly, you're absolutely right that the court is undemocratic. It's undemocratic by design, right? It is designed to be one of the three branches of government insulated from the temporary passions of the people, right? And that is, and so here's how you could undo it. You could say, Democrats get to make, while they're in power, Democrats, we can make 18 nominations to the Supreme Court. Then when Republicans take back the Senate in the midterm, and if they get the president, then they make another 36, right? And there we go. Then it will cease to function as a third branch of government in the American constitutional design that, with many, many flaws, right, has survived, has endured for over 200 years and has endured at a time when the court has often been the mechanism for some of the greatest social change in the progressive direction, right? That system would fall apart. So if you're talking about gay marriage, if you're talking about voting rights, if you're talking about one person, one vote, there are a lot of, for the right to privacy, a lot of those victories for the progressive movement have come from the court against what's popular at the moment.
So if a civil war happens here in the United States, it's not going to look like what we had in the 1860s. It's going to be what we call an insurgency. And that's, you could think of it as a modern type of civil war, but it's especially the type of civil war you see in countries with powerful governments and powerful militaries. And insurgencies tend to be decentralized. They tend to be fought by multiple different militias, paramilitary groups. Sometimes they work together, sometimes they don't. And the reason why you tend to see those types of conflicts is because they don't want to engage the military. If they are in head-to-head battle with the US military, they're going to lose. And so they're going to use non-conventional tactics, guerrilla warfare, where you have a bomb here, a bomb there, and then domestic terror that's going to be directed at both civilians and at infrastructure. So the people who are going to fight this here in the United States are the militias that have been forming. It's going to be the far-right groups, some of which have a military arm, some of which don't have a military arm yet. There are already groups here in the United States. They're called accelerationists. Accelerationists are groups that believe that they need to accelerate the path to civil war. They need to start a civil war because that's the only way that the United States is going to, that they're going to save the United States. Their logic isn't really very clear, but it's this notion that you have to burn it all down to rebuild it. They actually have a manual of how they're going to do it. It's called the Turner Diaries. You used to be able to buy it on Amazon. It's a fictitious account of a civil war in the United States, but it's really a manual of how to take down the US federal government. It talks about their strategy, which they call leaderless resistance. And it's really a form of cell warfare where you don't have a hierarchical organization. You have lots of different cells. Those are militias. And they're launching attacks throughout the country. And they're very clear when they say that they're going to do it this way because that is the hardest thing for the government to try to infiltrate and the hardest thing for the government to try to prevent and deter. I bought a copy of the Turner Diaries from Amazon back in December of 2020. It was in the top, I think, 50 of all books on Amazon. When I purchased it, Amazon, underneath they gave you a whole list of recommended titles that you could just click on to add to your cart, and it included Mein Kampf. It included, 5 or 6 anti-Semitic and racist books. And it was really quite astounding that if you wanted to go down that path and figure out what these groups were thinking, they're very public about it. It's just that most Americans aren't paying attention.
So glad you're now outselling that book. All right. Another.
Hello. Does economics play a role in this? I read an article several years ago which said that 40% of all U.S. households are living paycheck to paycheck with less than $400. And it was the article was the decline of the American middle class. Does that play a role in this? Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, it does. So the most important factor in what types of groups tend to mobilize and fight, the sons of the soil, is whether they lose political power. That seems to be much more motivating for them than economic loss. But if they also suffer economic loss, so there's an economic crisis at the same time, then that compounds it, and those types of groups are even more likely to mobilize resistance. And I'm trying to think of what would be a great example. I didn't talk about it much in the book, but so the Catholics in Northern Ireland, for example, they were discriminated against for decades, but they were increasingly shut out of the more lucrative jobs, and so economically they were declining over time as well. And if you look here in the United States, the Republican Party didn't become an ethnic faction really until, the Obama era. Prior to 2008, white Americans were almost equally likely to vote for Democrats as Republicans. But when Barack Obama was elected, the white working class began to gravitate from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. And that was surprising to many political scientists because from an economic perspective, the Democratic Party's policies were more in line with the working class. But if you think about what's happened to the white working class since the Clinton era, Clinton signed the NAFTA, and the average American benefited from that, but there were losers in that process. And the losers were those Americans who had enjoyed fairly well-paying union jobs in the manufacturing sector. And those jobs left the United States and they never came back. And neither party, including the Democrats who signed this bill, the Democrats didn't put any sort of safety net in place to support the losers in this process. And so if you look to see how the white working class has done on a host of measures, marriage rates, opioid addiction, suicide rates, annual salary, whether they own their own home or not, they have declined over the last, I don't know, that maybe a few decades. And while Latinos and African Americans at worst have remained steady. Now, that doesn't mean that white working class is doing worse than these other groups, but they feel it in. What we know about Sons of the Soil is what motivates them is this sense of loss of status, this loss of privilege, and it's relative to what they are seeing from other people in society. And I think the white working class, has observed that they are doing not only worse than their parents were doing, but they're doing worse than for example, people with fancy degrees who live on the coast and are competitive in the new economy that's emerged.
All right. Well, we've now hit our time limit, but hopefully we'll have an opportunity afterwards, after we close this event, for you to ask some questions. And I don't know if, Dean Freund, if you want to close the event or if I can just wrap it up. So, look, we have all been, in some ways, frightened by what we've heard today, but most importantly, we've been enlightened, right? The United States is now on our watch list, right? And importantly, people across the United States have heard this book, have understood its arguments, have grappled with it. Some of us still put our heads in the sands or not, we have now heard from a voice that used to be in the wilderness, but now is squarely in the middle of a conversation. And so we're so grateful that voice is from UC San Diego. That voice is from GPS, and that voice is Barb Walters. So thank you so much, Barb.
Yeah, thank you, Thad, and thank you everybody for coming.